My name is Kevin O'Neill, and I'm an associate professor of education and technology at Simon Fraser University in the Faculty of Education. And my primary areas of research interest are history education and design-based research.
Can you briefly tell us about what this article is about?
Sure. The paper is about what learning scientists can learn from architects and urban planners about how to go about and study visionary design. I make a distinction early in the paper about two different orientations to design that any design science can have. One I call building for the future, and that's a relatively modest kind of design in which you look at a future that seems likely to be coming and just try to be prepared for it or to make incremental improvements upon it. The other orientation, and we have this in the learning sciences, is what I call the build the future orientation, and it's more visionary in nature. In essence, it looks at a future that might be coming and says, oh no, we could do much better than that. And it tries to enable a very different future through a sort of grand act of design. Those designs tend to be very all-encompassing and tries essentially to put in place a very different future than is otherwise likely to happen.
I'm very interested in why do you want to write this paper, or what kind of problem you noticed maybe in the learning sciences, and then this motivate you to write this?
Right. Well, I've always been interested in architecture for a very long time, a couple of decades, I think, and my interest was quite recreational for a long time. So I would idly watch movies and read books and go on tours just because I was interested. Do you want me to repeat this? We're picking up.
I have a little bit problem hearing your answers.
Oh, hearing me? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see what can we do. Well, I'm okay.
Okay.
So, what question was that again? Why I was interested.
Why do you want to write this article?
Right. So I've been interested in architecture for a very long time, on a recreational basis entirely. So I did a lot of casual reading and watched films and went on tours. And as I read more, I began to realize that there were some things that architecture scholars were doing well that learning scientists don't seem to do so well. I've been surrounded by visionary design for pretty much my entire career as a learning scientist. I started out as a graduate student at Northwestern when Roger Schank and his colleagues were working on goal-based scenarios and trying to enable a very different future for learning in corporate and school settings. I worked as a research assistant on the COVIS project, Learning Through Collaborative Visualization, with Roy P. and Luis Gomez, and that was a visionary project as well of a very different kind, trying to imagine what science education could be like in the future with powerful visualization tools and fast internet access. And then later on as a postdoc, I went to the University of Toronto and worked with Scardamelia and Brighter, and they had their own vision of a knowledge society that would be possible with the right kinds of knowledge building tools and networks. I've been teaching about that work and other visionary work in learning sciences for a number of years. Now we have a PhD program at SFU that is that covers a lot of learning sciences work. And I realized that the literature, our literature, is not very supportive of telling the kinds of long-term stories about what happens with visionary design. Not as supportive of that kind of teaching as scholarship in architecture and urban planning is. Through reading more and more and less casually about architecture and urban planning, I began to realize that we could do a better job of going about and studying this particular kind of scholarship in the learning sciences, this visionary build the future work.
Thank you. I'm also like kind of pulling the knowledge building projects. Actually, I did my master on knowledge building in a science.
Right.
Okay, so it's very interesting that you are comparing the difference and similarities between architecture and the learning sciences.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think are the main differences and the similarities?
Right. Well, one of the main similarities that I point out in the paper is that architects and learning scientists, pardon me. Well, let me start that over. One of the main similarities between architects and learning scientists is that we all, in our different ways, believe very strongly in the power of design to improve life. So that, if you look at most learning sciences work, it is driven by that premise, that if we are clever enough about the designs that we create, and we're successful enough at scaling them up, then we can create a better future. And that's something that's a fundamental belief that architects share. There's, of course, many differences between the fields. One of the things that is an advantage that architects have over learning scientists, particularly with regard to studying this visionary design that I talk about, is that the artifacts of architecture and urban planning are enormous. They're highly visible. They last for a very long time. And you can study life in and around them in relatively simple ways. So some of the projects, one in particular that I talk about in the paper, a public housing project called Pruitt-Igoe. It had sociologists studying it and the life of the people living in it almost since day one, I think. So you can tell empirically grounded stories about the visions that architects and urban planners have over a very, very long story arc. And that's something that is much more difficult to do in learning sciences work because the data collection is so much more difficult because there are privacy issues and ethics issues. They're not insurmountable, but there are that's a sort of built-in advantage that architects and urban planners have with respect to their scholarship and learning over a long period of time about visionary design, how it's done, and its consequences.
So you mentioned the two orientations, designing the future and designing for the future.
Right.
So what are the two positions people usually take in doing the research?
What are the positions that
people usually take? You mean sometimes, how can you say that, okay, this is designing the future, this is designing for the future?
Right.
So
how do you make the distinction? Right. Well, when you look at specific examples, it's often pretty clear how to make the distinction between building for the future and building the future. So a key example that I use in the paper is the work of Seymour Papert and the logo movement. He was very explicit in Mindstorms that he thought there were two potential futures involving kids and computers. That there was one in which kids would be programmed by computers through drill and practice software and intelligent tutors. And he was terribly afraid of that. So that was, as he tells the story himself, his primary motivation for creating Logo and starting the Logo movement was to enable a future in which kids would learn to program computers rather than being programmed by them. So you could see with that example, there are others that I talk about in the paper, but you can see with that example, there is a projection about an unpleasant future that's coming if we don't do something now, right? So I think this sort of visionary work, the build the future work, often tends to be based on those sorts of dire predictions. Oh no, we're going to lose out to all of our trading partners in the future if kids aren't educated in a certain way today, our economy is going to collapse if we don't educate kids in a certain way. I talk a little bit about those sorts of dire predictions in the paper, and they're often not well founded.
Okay. Another question is, we know that many of the design research is very expensive,
Yes.
like the large-scale projects.
Right.
So should we use this money to create something new that doesn't exist, or we fit into the current systems to continue and to improve it? Say,
Right.
for example, the assessment systems in exam-oriented in Asian. So should we improve this system, or we create something that's totally different and as an alternative?
Right.
So what do you think?
Right. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to write this article is that I think it's inevitable that we will continue to have this sort of visionary work. The impulse for it is just so strong, and you can understand why, because it really feels so powerfully proactive to say we are taking things into our own hands and we are going to create the future that we want. Right? And if we didn't have that kind of inclination, then a lot of really great things would never get built. But you're right that visionary design tends to be very expensive, and it's risky. And so the point of the article really is not to argue that we should or shouldn't do particular kinds of design, or that one orientation is inherently better than the other. But I think it is important to recognize that build the future design is very risky. It has unique kinds of risks that the more modest incremental design doesn't have. And knowing that, we should go into our design work and go into the study of these visionary designs prepared to do things like observing and recording and making sense of the unintended consequences of design. So that's one of the things that's a theme that runs through the three cases that I talk about in the paper. Any design, especially a far-reaching one, will have unintended consequences. But in the learning sciences, we tend, for understandable reasons, we tend to focus on, when we set up a research protocol, we tend to focus on measuring the thing that we want to improve. It makes all the sense in the world, but usually the thing we want to improve is in a trade-off relationship with something else. So typical thing that that we worry about is depth versus breadth in curriculum, right? We want depth of understanding, but what might we sacrifice in curriculum coverage? That's one typical trade-off, but there are many. And the kind of surprising thing about the history of in particular the modernist era in architecture and urban planning, is that over and over again, these really experienced design professionals were caught unaware, they were blindsided by the unintended consequences of their designs. But unintended consequences are a fact of life. They should be no surprise. It's challenging, of course, to study something when it's unanticipated. But what I argue in the paper is that we need to get serious about this. If we want to have an empirically grounded design science, then we need to come to grips with studying unintended consequences in a rigorous way. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Did I answer the question?
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay. Well, push me then.
Yeah.
What?
But I get the main idea of that, but miss maybe some part of that. That's a little bit. Maybe the network's not very good.
Oh,
but I get
how about I
ideas.
turn off my camera and then hopefully you'll get better bandwidth for the audio?
Seems okay.
Seems okay now?
Let's see. And I'm still another question is that I'm wondering is because there are two orientations are both to improve life through design.
Yes.
And the aim of design is to prepare for a better future.
Mm-hmm.
But one problem is how are we going to predict the future that actually is quite difficult to predict? So how are you going to know what the future is or will be like?
Right. Well, so this is another thing that I think is it could be learned by studying a lot of different fields, but one of the things that's so impressive about the history of architecture and accounts of it is that it does show how how pesky and unpredictable the future is. People make predictions all the time, but I think there's a quote in the paper about how predictions often say more about the fears and the dreams of the people who make them than they say about what is actually going to happen. We tend to try to predict the future by looking at trends and extending them into the future, but you never know when one of these soaring trends is going to collapse, or when there is a trend that's rapidly growing but hasn't been visible yet, and it's suddenly going to do a hockey stick and overpower other influences that you're aware of in the present day. So but I guess nobody wants to say, particularly not designers and scholars who are writing grant proposals, that the future is fundamentally unpredictable and we can't really say what's going to happen. I think that's another reason for the attractiveness of the Build the Future orientation, is that it essentially says we're not going to wait around for the future to come, we're going to make it ourselves. I think that's, there's a famous quote that's often attributed to Alan Kay, that the best way to predict the future is to make it. But over and over again, you see that architects and urban planners had enormous resources to build the particular future that they wanted. And despite the enormous political and economic resources they had, they were still unable to build the specific future that they wanted. One project I talk about in the paper in some depth is this public housing project in St. Louis, Missouri, Pruitt-Igoe. And when it was taken down, it was later estimated, taken down after only 18 years of occupation, 18 pretty unhappy years. It was estimated later that it cost U.S. taxpayers $300 million not to build it and then take it down. It was a $300 million loss. But despite having those enormous sums of money and being experienced designers, they could not build the future that they wanted, not precisely. There are some efforts that worked out better than others, and I talk about one of those in the paper as well. So I don't think there's, I mean, this may sound simplistic, but there isn't a crystal ball that we can look into. We often like to believe that we know what's coming in the future. And that's why I guess the long-term bets that you make with visionary design are especially risky. The near-term future is pretty predictable. Tomorrow is going to be more or less like today. And so that's one of the reasons why incremental design is so much less risky.
Yeah, and also you analyze the lessons learned from these architecture projects.
Right.
Maybe you can also give us some design suggestions on the learning sciences, or what we have learned from these designs from the architectures.
Right, right. Well, I think I mentioned one of the lessons already, which is the importance of studying unintended consequences, trying to capture them in some way. And that may be very imperfect, but I think the thing that I find really admirable in the architecture scholarship is that these people have spent decades reflecting on the fundamental lessons of that era in architectural design and urban planning, and so they've been able to get better at what they do in some fundamental ways. Whereas I'm not sure that we have the same kind of cumulative knowledge building in the learning sciences with regard to this sort of visionary design work. I'd be interested in somebody making a case that we seem to be getting better at it over time, because it doesn't quite look that way to me. So that's one lesson. Another lesson has to do with the danger of taking primary design inspiration from a technological trend. Because, many learning scientists, including myself, are very fond of digital technology and like to follow trends. And so we get excited when we see, oh, such and such is getting cheaper over time. Oh, such and such is becoming very popular. So those sorts of trends are easy to observe, but because they're easy to observe, easier than, say, social trends, they can have undue influence on our design work. So taking primary design inspiration from trends, and especially technological trends, I think is dangerous, and that's illustrated very powerfully by the scholarship that I review on architecture and urban planning.
Okay, I think we get most of the questions. How about we take? You can do it individually.
Sure.
I don't need to ask questions now.
Okay.
It's very nice talking with you.
Yeah.
I think we can do and it is kind of like welcome to discuss in the webinar.
Sure.
That kind of stuff. And then one is 2 to 3 sentences about, okay, this article, I analyzed the blah, 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 and a very quick intro in the article.
Okay.
I will put it in the very beginning.
Okay, so you want me to just say a very brief introduction to what the article is about?
Yes. One is what the article is about, very short, and then at the end will be welcome to my webinar, that kind of stuff. There's 2 things.
Oh, okay. So let me take a run at the first one. So you just want me to say, do you want me to say the title of the paper? Or no?
Okay. I want you to say, you didn't need to say the title of the paper. We'll put it in the subtitles.
Right.
You only need to say 2 to 3 sentences about, okay, in this paper is about blah, blah, blah. This is like the abstract.
Got it. Okay, sure.
Yeah. I analyzed the 3 architecture projects and the key ideas, like what we do on Facebook tests.
Right.
Audio one.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
So let me see. So this article is about lessons that learning scientists can learn from architects and urban planners, in particular the modernist era in architecture and urban planning, roughly from the 1920s to the 1970s. I examined 3 cases of visionary build the future designs that were very professionally done and very well funded, but had a lot of unintended consequences. And I examine then, reflecting on those cases, some of the lessons that that learning scientists can draw about how they can get better at doing and studying this sort of visionary design work themselves. Does that cover it?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. That's
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
That would be good. And then another one is we're putting it at the end to welcome people to the webinar.
Okay, so you just want me to say, hi, I'm Kevin O'Neill, welcome to my webinar?
Yes, kind of. Let's discuss more in the webinar, blah blah. That
Okay.
kind of stuff.
I see. Okay. So I should just say something like, please join me in my webinar if you want to learn more about this, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Please join me in my webinar if you want to learn more about this.
Yeah.
Okay. So Lillian, it seems like we're. Oh, sorry. It seems like we've covered most of what we want to cover. About the video,
Yes.
how do you want us to get that to you? How do you want us to get the video to you?
Oh yeah, maybe you ask the staff, the colleagues from your place to upload the video to a Google Drive or Dropbox
Google
or
Drive
something,
or Dropbox.
and then
Okay.
send me the link. I will cut the video and edit a little bit to make it a 2-minute or short one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Brian's nodding. This is no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you just send me the video link. Of course, I also got the one that you are doing the keynote. I
Right.
think some of them are introducing the architecture projects.
Mhm.
So we can use a few seconds or some of them, and then we can combine both.
Okay. Or
Yeah.
I liked the